Hello everybody, this is your host, and today we see how 30 men took over a city for Brazil's biggest heist. So let's get into it. On December 1st, 2020 at around 8 a.m. local time, a group of municipal workers were going about their day painting street lines on the BR-376 highway in the Brazilian state of Parana, when they were ambushed by a group of men wearing masks and driving SUVs. They took the workers hostage and forced them into two buses, which they then drove to a nearby highway where they abandoned them. The men who had carried out the ambush then set up roadblocks across the city, preventing anyone from entering or leaving. They placed some of their number advantage points overlooking the streets, looking out for any police presence. A witness later said that one of the men manning the lookout position was carrying what looked like a sniper rifle. They also set fire to several trucks and cars, creating massive roadblocks that would confuse any emergency services trying to reach the area. As the morning wore on, people began to notice a growing police presence in the streets. At around 10 a.m., officers started to arrive on the scene, but as they tried to move through the roadblocks to get to the hijacked buses, they came under fire from the men with guns. As the police closed in, the men in the lookout positions opened fire on the officers, forcing them to take cover and retreat. Shots were fired near the headquarters of the military police. One officer was wounded. It soon became clear that this wasn't just a traffic accident or a random act of violence. Instead, it was a carefully planned attack aimed at one place, the Banco do Brasil treasury, which was located just a few miles away. This was no ordinary bank. It was the largest cash vault in southern Brazil, housing around 40 tons of gold and more than $200 million in various currencies. The men responsible for the attack were prepared to defend their position, and they made it clear that they were willing to use deadly force against anyone who tried to stop them. By now, dozens of heavily armed men had arrived on the scene. They were split into three groups, each led by a commander. One group was responsible for guarding the hostages. Another was in charge of attacking any police or military personnel who tried to intervene. And the third was tasked with carrying out the heist itself. As the siege dragged on, more and more police and military personnel arrived on the scene, but they were all forced to stay back, due to the heavy gunfire coming from the men inside the bank. At one point, an armored vehicle was seen driving past the burning roadblocks and heading towards the bank. It was hit by gunfire and forced to turn around. At around 12:30 p.m., the men inside the bank detonated two explosive devices, causing a power cut in the area. This made it even more difficult for the police to carry out any kind of meaningful response. For their part, the attackers made no effort to hide what they were doing. In fact, they seemed to be enjoying the chaos that they had created. They used social media to taunt the police and brag about their impending success. One video posted online showed a man dressed in black standing next to a burning car. He turned the camera towards his face, revealing a ski mask that covered his entire head. He then raised his middle finger in a gesture of defiance before walking away. By now, the whole city was effectively sealed off. No one could get in or out, and the attackers were able to move around freely. They even set up checkpoints of their own, stopping and searching vehicles as they pleased. At around 2 p.m., the men inside the bank began unloading sacks of cash onto the floor. Some of them were stamped with the seal of the Central Bank of Brazil, indicating that they contained the country's new 200 real notes. These are only made available to banks in limited quantities, and are designed to prevent counterfeiting. Each bundle contains 400 bills, which means that the haul from the Banco do Brasil alone could be worth up to $8 million. But the attackers weren't satisfied with just robbing the bank. They also wanted to send a message. They left a note behind which read, "We're here because we're tired of living like this. We're taking what belongs to us. Don't blame us. Blame the government." Meanwhile, the siege was still ongoing. The police were still unable to enter the bank and rescue the hostages. The men inside were getting restless, and they began demanding food and water. At around 4 p.m., a small army of heavily armed men entered the bank through a back door. They split up into teams and began methodically clearing out the building. The men inside were caught off guard and they didn't stand a chance. One of the attackers was killed in the raid. Once the building was cleared, the police and military personnel searched the area for any other signs of the attackers. They found a large amount of weapons and ammunition, as well as several homemade explosive devices. In the end, however, they were no match for the might of the Brazilian security forces. Of the 30 men who had taken over the city, 26 were arrested. 4 of them were killed in the ensuing gunfight. The mastermind behind the attack, a man known only as Fernando, managed to escape. He remains at large to this day. In the aftermath of the attack, many questions were asked about how the men had managed to carry out such a daring heist. The Brazilian government launched a full investigation and vowed to bring those responsible to justice. In a statement, President Jair Bolsonaro praised the work of the security forces and said that those responsible for the attack would not go unpunished. He also announced a reward of $100,000 for any information leading to the arrest of Fernando, the mastermind behind the heist. The attack itself was unprecedented in modern Brazilian history. Never before had a group of armed men taken over an entire city and held it hostage. It was a brazen act of violence that shocked the nation and left many people wondering how something like this could have happened. The men involved were part of a gang that had been operating in the area for some time. They were led by a former police officer who had turned to a life of crime. He recruited a number of accomplices, and together they planned the heist of the century. The gang had been watching the city for months, looking for a way to strike. They chose the municipal workers as their first targets because they knew that they would be easy prey. The workers were unarmed and outnumbered, so there was no way that they could defend themselves. The gang then set up a series of roadblocks around the city. This prevented any emergency services from reaching the area and ensured that the workers were trapped. The roadblocks were manned by heavily armed men who were willing to use deadly force against anyone who tried to break through. The gang's main target was the Banco do Brasil treasury. This was the richest bank in the area, and the gang knew that it would be heavily guarded. That's why they brought along explosives and automatic weapons. They were prepared to fight their way through anything to get to the money. Once inside the bank, the gang split up into different teams. Some of them took hostages while others began searching for the vault. They found what they were looking for and began loading up sacks of cash. The gang then barricaded themselves inside the bank and waited for the police to come for them. They knew that they couldn't stay there forever, so they had to make sure that they got away with as much money as possible. When the police finally did arrive, the gang was ready for them. They opened fire as soon as the police tried to enter the building. This went on for several hours, but in the end, the police were able to clear out the bank and arrest most of the gang members. Only a few got away, including the mastermind, Fernando. The attack was a major embarrassment for the Brazilian government. It showed that even in a country with strong security forces, criminals can still strike if they're willing to take the risks. It also highlighted the level of corruption that exists in Brazil. Many of the gang members had connections to the police and military, which helped them to carry out their attack. In the aftermath, the government took steps to improve security in the country and to crack down on corruption, but the damage was done. The image of Brazilian security forces had been tarnished, and the country was left reeling from the audacity of the attack. Hey everybody, thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed this video and learned something new. If you want to keep watching, the next video I recommend is right here. Thanks again for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.